thought appears, and almost immediately it feels settled. An interpretation forms, and within it comes a quiet internal yes. From the inside, that movement feels like thought that has turned into reached a conclusion. It makes sense to experience it in that way because when something feels clear and arrives without friction, it signals coherence. That coherence feels earned, and in the sense that if a judgment presents itself smoothly, it seems reasonable to assume that the appropriate evaluation has already taken place. But what goes unnoticed is that the feeling of certainty often precedes examination. The mind doesn't only generate thought, it generates assent. It then authorizes its own interpretations before they're inspected. And because that authorization is fused with the thought itself, it rarely appears as a separate act. When that distinction remains invisible, you experience yourself as deciding, while in practice you may be endorsing what has already been structured internally. The discipline that examines this separation between appearance and assent is metacognition. Once that separation becomes visible, certainty no longer feels like the natural endpoint of reasoning. It begins to look like something that occurs earlier in the sequence as something that may or may not have earned the authority that it will carry.
Super quick interruption. I'm in a little town in Thailand, and just to make sure that my immunities, keep up, and I don't get sick as fuck, which has been a risk. I'm taking some vitamin C, super high quality. Honestly, I do notice the difference, which is incredible because I usually wouldn't. But if you want to learn more information, it's in the description or bio, I don't even know. But if not, I don't really care. Let's get back to getting better though.
When certainty feels like a natural conclusion to thought, what happens is an idea occurs. It seems coherent, and the sense of rightness attaches to it almost immediately. From the inside, that sequence feels like unified thinking, but you don't feel the steps that got you to that point. See, there's distinctions inside that experience that usually go unnoticed. A thought can appear in the mind without yet being endorsed. An interpretation can form without yet being granted authority, and the appearance of a claim and the assent to that claim are not the same operation even if they arrive close together. As humans, we tend to collapse them in the way that if a judgment arises and feels clear, we treat that clarity as evidence that we have already evaluated it. The fact that we are conscious of the thought is taken as proof that we have considered it, which causes awareness to be mistaken for examination. Metacognition begins at this fracture. It refers to the capacity to represent not just the content of thought, but your relationship to it. Not simply, this is true, but I'm about to treat this as true. That difference introduces a layer that is usually invisible and separates what appears from what is authorized. This matters because the mind doesn't present its outputs as tentative. It presents them as ready for endorsement. A reaction forms, and with it comes a subtle internal yes. That yes feels embedded in the thought itself. You don't notice that it's a separate act because it feels like the thought and the approval are the same thing. The issue isn't that thought arises, it always will. The issue is that assent often occurs so quickly that it feels indistinguishable from perception. And when the act of endorsement remains invisible, what you experience as thinking may already be commitment. When the distinction between appearance and assent is visible, the sequence of thinking looks different. We tend to imagine that judgment is a result of evaluation, that we weigh considerations, consider alternative, and then decide. But in practice, assent often occurs at the level of first interpretation. The mind presents a reading of a situation and the internal yes attaches before reflection has intervened. When you hear a statement in conversation and immediately experience agreement or resistance, or when someone's tone registers as disrespectful and irritation rises before you consider other explanations, in each example, the interpretation appears and assent follows so quickly that it feels like a single moment. But there's a subtle switch in order between commitment and reasoning. Once assent has been granted, thought reorganizes itself around preservation. Explanations are generated, counter-arguments are anticipated, and supporting evidence is retrieved. From the inside, this feels like careful analysis, but structurally, you're granting reinforcement for the commitment made beforehand. The confusion persists because the act of assent doesn't feel like a choice, it feels like recognition. The mind doesn't tell you you are now endorsing this claim. It presents the claim with the tone of settledness, which is easily mistaken for truth rather than identified as authorization. The issue isn't that interpretation happens quickly, it's that endorsement happens without being noticed. And when assent precedes scrutiny, what follows cannot fully function as examination. It operates within the boundaries of a conclusion that has already been granted authority. When assent is granted, the belief begins to take on more weight than a mere interpretation. It becomes part of how you orient yourself in the world. A position that has been endorsed no longer feels like a claim under consideration. It feels like a settled stance. And settled stances tend to integrate into identity. This is where the distinction between appearance and assent becomes essential. A thought can pass through the mind without consequence, but once it's treated as true, it begins to anchor behavior, expectations, and self-understanding. To question it later is not just to revisit an idea, it's to destabilize something that has already been incorporated. This is why revision often feels disproportionate. Changing a belief can feel like admitting weakness, inconsistency, or error in character, and the disagreement from others can feel less like intellectual challenge and more like personal affront. At that point, the original act of assent has fused the belief with the self. The mechanism is cumulative. Each time a belief is endorsed and acted upon, it reinforces coherence. That coherence reinforces stability, which reinforces a sense of self. Over time, the line between this is what I think and this is who I am becomes difficult to trace. In ordinary situations, this appears in subtle ways, like a person resists feedback not because the feedback is irrational, but because accepting it would unsettle their self-concept of as competent. A political position hardens over years of public defense until reconsideration feels like betrayal, and a moral judgment, once voiced confidently, becomes harder to revisit without embarrassment. The issue isn't that identity forms around belief. That's inevitable. The issue is that the original act of assent, the moment a claim was granted authority, has been forgotten. What began as an interpretation now feels intrinsic. And when that origin is obscured, questioning the belief no longer feels like examination, it feels like self-erosion. If assent does fuse with identity, then governance follows from endorsement rather than from thought itself. Thoughts arise continuously, interpretations, reactions, and judgments appear without invitation. But what directs behavior isn't the mere presence of these mental elements, it's whether they're granted authority. We often equate agency with having reason. If we can articulate why we acted, we assume the action was deliberate, but articulation can occur after assent. A reached justification can be constructed around a conclusion that was already authorized. So in that case, agency is retrospective, and the mind explains what it's already endorsed. The distortion lies in treating the appearance of a thought as evidence of authorship, because that thought feels internal, it feels owned, and then it feels chosen. The transition from this interpretation appeared to this is my position happens without a visible checkpoint. The mechanism is simple but consequential. When assent is granted, behavior aligns with it, tone shifts, decisions are made, arguments are defended. When this happens, it shows the original endorsement wasn't examined and its authority remains unquestioned. This is visible in everyday situations. A manager interrupts an employee's silence as defiance and responds with corrective action, never revisiting the interpretation itself. A friend assumes a slight and withdraws, constructing a narrative that supports the initial reading. A voter adopts a stance behind an immediate alignment and later gathers reasons to fortify it. In each case, action flows from authorship interpretation, not from suspended evaluation. The issue isn't that thought influences behavior, because that's natural. The issue is that without recognizing assent as a separate act, influence becomes indistinguishable from decision. Agency then appears intact even when it's operating downstream of an endorsement that was never consciously examined. When governance follows assent, then the critical capacity is not the ability to generate better thoughts, but the ability to see the act of endorsement itself. Metacognition doesn't stop interpretations from appearing or eliminating reactions. You'll still continue to feel conviction. What it introduces is the possibility of suspension. Suspension is the space between appearance and authorization. So when an interpretation forms like "this is disrespectful," "this is wrong," or "this is obviously true," instead of immediately granting its authority, you register that the interpretation appeared. The content remains, but its status changes, so it no longer is a conclusion, but now more of a candidate. We often treat reflection as something expansive and complex, but at its core, metacognition is narrow. It's the recognition that a mental event has occurred and that assent has not yet been finalized. That recognition creates a subtle pause. It won't require new information, just that the feeling of certainty be observed rather than obeyed. The mechanism here is separation. When the mind can represent its own endorsement, "I am about to treat this as true," the authority of the claim becomes contingent. It depends on whether that assent is sustained after inspection. Without this layer, assent feels inevitable, but with it, assent becomes optional. In practice, this might appear as hesitation before responding sharply in conversation, not because the reaction vanished, but because it was seen. It might also appear as reconsideration of an initial judgment, not because doubt overwhelmed conviction, but because the conviction was noted as a mental event rather than as an unquestionable fact. The interpretation still exists. What shifts is its immediate authority. The issue isn't the certainty must disappear, it's that certainty no longer completes the process. When suspension is possible, endorsement no longer fuses with appearance, which lets certainty begin to depend on examination rather than on how strongly it's felt. When assent can be suspended, certainty loses its role as final authority. Interpretations still form with varying degrees of force, but the presence of certainty no longer concludes the process. It becomes part of what must be examined. Earlier, certainty appeared as the endpoint of thinking. A conclusion felt clear, and that clarity was treated as evidence that reasoning had already occurred. Now the order shifts. Certainty is understood as a signal that endorsement is being requested. It indicates that a claim has been presented with force, not that it has been justified. This reframing alters the stability of conviction. What once felt self-validating now depends on whether assent was granted after suspension rather than before it. A belief that survives inspection may still be held confidently, but its confidence is no longer grounded in immediacy alone. It's grounded in having withstood examinations. The structural change is subtle and decisive. Certainty is demoted from verdict to data, as something that the mind produces, not what it must listen to. The demotion doesn't eliminate conviction, it just situates it within a sequence that can be traced and evaluated. So what initially felt like an unmistakable sense that a conclusion was simply true turns out to depend on whether the act of assent was ever made visible. And once that act is visible, certainty no longer feels like proof, it feels like a responsibility. Certainty first appeared as the endpoint of thought. A conclusion felt clear, and that clarity was taken as evidence that it had already been examined. But the sequence that produces that feeling runs earlier than most people notice. An interpretation appears, assent attaches, coherent, stabilizes. Only afterwards does reasoning organize itself around what has already been authorized. Because that order is rarely inspected, certainty is treated as proof rather than as output. Metacognition doesn't remove conviction, it exposes the act that grants it authority. Once assent is visible as a separate operation, certainty can no longer justify itself. It becomes something produced by the mind, not something that stands above it. So what looked like clarity turns out to depend on whether endorsements were examined before it was granted. And once that distinction is visible, certainty doesn't feel as self-sufficient as it did.